Tony Russo from On Deathcare, and this is your weekly news update. We have a bunch of cool stories. We're going to talk about Neil deGrasse Tyson and his pitch for non-religious burial as a disposition, or rather, how to pitch the non-religious on burial. It was a really cool little bit of his recent podcast that I want to share with you. There is also a story about a funeral home whose landlord was probably as much responsible for its own demise as it was itself, plus some other, of course, the Oklahoma failure of democracy and, of course, the NOR bill. Lots of other stories to get to, and we will get to them in just a moment. Before we do, I want to thank all of my subscribers. Thank you very much for subscribing to On Deathcare. If you are not a subscriber to On Deathcare, please do so. You can find it in the link wherever you're watching this. You can go to ondeathcare.com and then click the subscribe link. You'll get all of the shows that I put out, all of the stories that I put out. If you choose to become a paid subscriber, you'll also get the Sunday column, which includes something of a news roundup and any breaking stories or any stories that I'm working on that I think would be interesting to know in advance. All right, let's get into it. This is editorializing, and I just want to let you know right up front where I stand. The failure of the NOR bill in Oklahoma this week as I'm reporting it anyway, recently, made me nervous. Now, I talk about NOR a lot. The reason that I talk about NOR a lot is that it is in the news a lot. And I wouldn't call myself an endorser. It's not the way that I, for example, intend to go. But I do think that the way that it is adopted says a lot about the modern funeral industry. And Oklahoma was depressing, if not disappointing. And what made it depressing, I wrote a story about it, and you can find the link to the story is in the show notes. I dread making funeral service political. No one wants to be in a Republican or a Democrat funeral home. You don't want to have to put red or blue on the front of your funeral home so people know what kind of person you are. And the way that they were able to kill NOR, which passed. So I'm sorry, I don't know if you've read the story. Let me bring you up to date. So the natural organic reduction has been on the docket in Oklahoma for a while, and the fight has been really, really nasty. And one of the and the fight has been nasty, and between Republicans, between the pro-business Republicans and the anti-NOR Republicans. There's one idiot, honestly, on Twitter just saying some truly awful things, and one of his colleagues is like, this guy's a liar and he's just looking for his social media acclaim, which is why I've not mentioned his name. But the measure passed with a 60% of the vote. It got to the governor's desk, and this person said that NOR is a kind of thing that Democrats do, and we don't want it in our state. His area, his district is mostly corporate funeral homes. So, I don't know how closely, the general manager or whatever is watching local legislation, and I don't know what kind of effect they expect to have. They're a corporate entity is just there to do their thing. They're not there for the wider thing of what does funeral service look like in this area. But if you guys are all, not all of you, many, if not most, funeral homeowners are, if not connected politically, adjacent to being connected politically. And I would just ask you, if you see stuff like this starting to happen in your states as November comes along, maybe do what you can to put the kibosh on it. I mean, you don't have to say that we should pass or not pass, whatever, but calling anything that has to do with the disposition of the dead like a Democrat or a Republican thing, that's bad news for everybody. That is horrible news for your business. And I figured I'd give you a heads up on it because it worked. So this guy killed NOR by calling it a Democrat thing. So if you are in a liberalish state and they decide that they're going to start calling your funeral home a Republican type funeral home, or if you are in a more conservative state and they decide they're going to start calling your funeral home, a Democratic funeral home, it's gross. And I know that you have to be gross if you want to be in politics because normal people can't do it. Those of us who have to look in the mirror and, not have stomach sickness all of our lives, we can't handle being in that kind of awful business. But if you know someone who's in it and they somehow can still look themselves in the mirror before they try to politicize literally everything, just watching out for yourself. Just a heads up, because it's only May. And if you can kill something in the middle of the road, he said only, one of the things that this guy said was, only Biden states have passed it, which is it's patently untrue. It's patently untrue for anyone who cares to notice, but for people who just want to know what side they're supposed to be on, it's bad news. And, this is kind of a live by the sword, die by the sword antic, I guess, to participate in. And hopefully it comes back and ruins his entire life, maybe even his family's life. That would be great. Anyway, link to my story and to the broader story in the show notes. We have mentioned before that Minnesota has trouble with green burial. And it looks as if the state is taking steps to reduce the trouble of green burial in the state. So public cemeteries, there is a bill that is in the Senate and in the House. It is SF 5305 in the Minnesota legislature, Senate. And what it does is it makes it so that public cemeteries can't deny a type of burial if it's a person's religious or moral convictions. So the short version is all cemeteries have to allow as much green burial as their sales can accomplish. So before this, there was a limited number of green burial spots per cemetery. And of course, as you know, the question always comes down to vaults. And do you need vaults? Do you need to have embalming? Do you need to have a particular kind of casket? And these are the things that public cemeteries in Minnesota tend to get into trouble over the last several years. There have been a lot of kind of butting of heads, muchly because of the disconnect between Muslim burial practices and traditional Christian burial practices. A lot of the cemeteries have rules that say we have to put you in a vault, we have to do this, we have to do that, that are contrary to the way that Muslim people prefer to be buried, and contrary to people who want to have a regular green burial with just a, let's say, shroud, and or maybe a wicker casket or something like that. And so this is the kind of thing that is moving through the legislature now, and I hope nothing awful happens during the discussion of it. Essentially, all it means is that if you have a cemetery, if you have a public cemetery, you can't prevent people from being buried without a vault, or you can't require embalming, or all of the things that are incompatible with what we've come to call green burial have to be allowed in the cemetery and not limited to a certain number, because it used to be like 300 spaces per cemetery or something. There was kind of an arbitrary number that they're getting rid of, so it's not a problem that I don't recall it. Anyway, there's a link to my story. I wrote a little story about the legislation because there wasn't any other thing to go on, and that is in the show notes. Speaking of green burial and personal conviction, astrophysicist and man about town, I guess, Neil deGrasse Tyson, took up green burial on his podcast recently. Actually, he did not even mention green burial. He just said burial. And they were talking about, someone had asked a question about, what's the way, if you're not a religious person, what's the best way to be, what's the best form of disposition? And of course he's like, I'm not going to say what the best form is. I'm just going to tell you what I'm going to do and why. And what he said is that he's going to be buried. And I'm going to read you his quote. If I'm buried and I decompose, all that energy gets absorbed by microbes, by flora and fauna, dining upon my body the way I have dined upon flora and fauna my whole life. And then he described the process as giving back to the earth what I had taken or literally borrowed over my life. And, he goes on to say that, when you're cremated, your energy is shot out to the stars as infrared energy. So it was cool and there's a link to the whole show in the show notes. So it was cool to see him break down the science, the pop kind of science behind decomposition, or behind these two types of dispositions. But it's also something to keep in mind. When I shared this story, one of the things that I said was, they say that, cremation is on the rise because of religious nuns, which is possibly true. But this is something that you can use when you're talking, or you can bring up when you're talking to cremation families, and say these are some of the non-religious ways that you can participate in burial, if that is something that you're interested in. If it's not, I have to have a church service if I'm going to be buried. You can just have a burial, and these are some good reasons to choose burial. Trying to maybe keep the earth as a closed system. He didn't talk about any of the other aquamation or natural organic reductions methods, but anyway, there's a link to the story and to the video, the video podcast, in the show notes. In Iberia Parish, Louisiana, Fields Funeral Home has closed, and it has been ordered to vacate the property following an eviction over unpaid rent. I don't know if I mentioned this story 2 weeks ago, because this is a story I've been following a little bit. Fields Funeral Home was under fire for improperly storing bodies, is the best way to put it. They failed an inspection, and they had their license suspended, and now they've been evicted, and it looks bad for Fields. But on their website, on Google, it says temporarily closed. They may be able to move to another place. What has come out recently is the unpaid rent had to do with incomplete facility management. And so the owner of the building, this is a leased building, right? And so the owner of the building has not upgraded the air conditioner, has not fixed a leaky roof. And these are all things that, Mr. Fields, Wilfred Fields, isn't able to do, or doesn't have the means to do. So he put in a bunch of new air conditioning, and he tried to keep the at least the storage rooms at the right temperature, but the rest of the funeral home was uncomfortably warm. And now he's the $200,000 behind in his rent, but it's only because he hasn't been paying the rent. Instead, he's been paying about $3,500 a month in increased electricity bills with his cobbled together air conditioning system. So the company, and there's a link in the show notes that includes a kind of a tour of the funeral director with Wilfred Fields, and you got to give him credit for standing up and saying, no, I did whatever I could do. I just got stuck. And, inviting the television people in to say, look, this is the best I can do. But something more, and something worth discussing, is this notion of leased properties, right? So as real estate gets tighter, people may, for example, decide to lease their space. When you lease a space, if you're going to put a funeral home in it, I think of Mr. Fields. You don't want to be trapped by a landlord who feels like they're not getting enough money out of you and is going to, and I'm not saying this is what happened here. I know that this happens with landlords in general because they're just such sweet folks. They don't do the repairs, and then you're forced to make a decision about moving. And I don't know that that is what happened here. But if you're considering leasing or are leasing, this is the kind of thing you have to get under control, because if they can ruin your entire reputation by not living up to the terms of their lease, and then if you don't pay the rent because they're not providing the services like air conditioning and a non-leaky roof, then again it still goes on you, and then you're out in the street. So there's a link to that story in the show notes, but more thinking about what is going on with leased properties and the inherent dangers in having a leased property. This is something that I didn't quite get to cover the last time I did one of these shows, but fortunately or unfortunately, there's always another scandal that will give me a chance to make my point. In my Sunday column, the last Sunday column that I did, I shouted out Matthew Bailey of Bailey Family Funeral Homes in Connecticut, who responded the way I've been dying for just someone to respond to a big scandal, a pre-need swindling scandal in his home state, by making a television ad. This is not how things should be. This is how things should be. And this is how you know these are some of the things that you ought to be doing. You don't have to be afraid to take out pre-need, but when you do take out pre-need, these are some of the things that you should know so that you don't get taken advantage of. And I love this idea of just headfirst attacking the problem, which was not, clearly it's not his fault. And his funeral home isn't the one that got taken down by this scandal, but he's a member of a larger community, and he stepped up and said, this is not how we are, and this is how we are. And anyway, it's a great commercial. I can put the link in the show notes. But this week they sentenced that man in Bad Axe. Terry Alvin Kaufman was sentenced to 7 to 20 years in prison after pleading no contest in March to nearly 40 charges, including conducting a criminal enterprise, embezzlement, and conversion of funeral contracts. Essentially, he was buying lottery tickets with his pre-need funds instead of sending them on to the proper authorities. And, the Michigan Funeral Directors Association, they came out and they said, this is improper and this is why it's improper when asked by the state. And this is just me sounding off because that is my job. It would be interesting to see if more funeral directors associations or more independent funeral homes just stepped up and did like what Matthew Bailey did and said, this is what you need to look for. Like a public education push about how to safely buy pre-need might also be a good way to get people to think about pre-need, and facing it head on rather than, hoping, someone was on vacation and didn't see that, a bunch of, there were like 200 families that got caught up in this one in Michigan. And that is those are 200 people that are going to tell everyone they know never to buy funeral insurance. And that's not great, right? That's not great for anybody. So don't be afraid to undertake a public campaign like Matthew did to say, no, there are, here's how to tell a bad actor. I'll tell you what, since I'm telling you, I'm not a bad actor, and we can make all of this happen without jeopardizing all of your money in case of some, sleazeball who steals funeral money. So there's a link to the story in the show notes. There's not much in the story that I haven't told you, but I'll put the link there. Oh, well, I'm sorry, it's $1.1 million in Michigan. So now I've told you everything that was in the story, but you can still take a look at it at the link in the show notes. And finally, state regulators have revoked the license of the historic Japanese cemetery in Colma, California, following years of leadership disruption and regulatory delinquency exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this traditional Japanese cemetery was run by incredibly old Japanese people, several of whom, or many of whom, did not speak a lot of English. And when the pandemic happened, they weren't really able to operate using Zoom. They were just too old to pick up on Zoom, and there was not a young contingent on the cemetery board. And so as a result, they fell behind in many of their practices, including in many of their responsibilities, including paying the taxes, which is the primary reason that they were shut down. But a younger person has stepped up, a lawyer who is representing them pro bono, Donald Tamaki. He said that the grounds will remain open and they will remain maintained while they get this all figured out. They will get the back taxes paid and they'll get it back open. And I think that, this is a wake-up call that if you want to have a place to be buried, somebody has to be in charge of that. And it made me think of, I read so many stories from my friend Tom Narndorf at American Cemetery and Cremation Magazine. He loved to do stories about, cemetery boards because it's a weird thing, but it's an important thing. And, primarily older folks serving on cemetery boards is not new or weird. And things like this, this is a private cemetery, but even in public cemeteries, these things can happen very easily if you're not doing a good job at getting in new blood. So there's a link to that story in the show notes. And that will do it for this time. This has been an On Deathcare production. It was written, edited, videoed, all of the fun things by me, Tony Russo. I did it because I love to do it, and I did it because my paid subscribers make the time possible for me to do this and to do all of the coverage that I do at ondeathcare.com. And again, please subscribe to ondeathcare.com. I'd love it if you became a paid subscriber, but if you become a subscriber, that's the first start. You can make sure that it is worth your while. I try to make it worth your while. I know that your time is precious. I know that I ask a lot of it, and I try to make it worth it. Like several of the stories that I wrote this week, I'm going to put in a batch email rather than, bludgeon you with emails every day. I try to be gentle and I try to be different. I try to put things out that you're not already reading elsewhere. That's kind of my thing. So anyway, I would love it if you subscribe. I thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will check in with you next time.